Hola. Hi Roy, can you hear me?
Sí puedo.
Okay, great. I'm really sorry for the delay. I think that we should start. Buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a comenzar con esta es la primera conferencia magistral del Congreso. Hoy nos acompaña para dar esta conferencia el profesor Brouwer. Me gustaría comentar un poco quién es Roy y de qué es lo que nos va a hablar. Roy es economista ambiental, ahora mismo trabaja en el Departamento de Economía en la Universidad de Waterloo, en Canadá. Él estudió economía en Wageningen, en los Países Bajos, y luego hizo el doctorado en economía ambiental en la Universidad de East Anglia, en el Reino Unido. Cuando finalizó su estudio, estuvo trabajando en el Ministerio del Agua de Holanda durante 5 años como responsable de apoyo económico a las políticas hídricas, incluida era cuando empezaba el tema de la Directiva Marco del Agua, y en 2005 se fue a la creo que se dice así, University, que está en Ámsterdam, como director del Departamento de Economía. Desde 2016 ya se fue a Canadá y dirige la Cátedra de Economía de los Recursos Hídricos de la Universidad de Waterloo, además de ser director ejecutivo del Instituto del Agua de esta universidad. Este centro es uno de los centros interdisciplinares de investigación del agua más grandes que hay en Norteamérica. Además, es miembro del Comité Asesor del Programa de Doctorado sobre el Sistema de Recursos Hídricos de la Universidad Técnica de Viena. Es miembro del Comité Asesor Científico Internacional de la Academia de Investigación de Ciencias Ambientales de China y es fundador y editor jefe de la revista Water Resource Economics. Los que les gustan los índices, pues ayer miré, tiene 211 publicaciones en los últimos años, un índice H de 39 y una media de 10 artículos por año. Pero por encima de todo eso, Roy es colaborador asiduo con nuestro grupo de investigación. Además, es una persona que siempre ha estado dispuesta a compartir su conocimiento con nosotros. Por eso yo le agradezco un montón que esté esta tarde aquí con nosotros y que pueda compartir parte de lo que sabe. Él habla español, pero dice que prefiere hacer la conferencia en inglés. Entonces, bueno, pues su exposición es sobre la valoración económica y el precio del agua de riego. Roy, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Y también Lita y los otros organizadores de este congreso para invitarme. Lo siento que no puedo estar con vosotros hoy. También hago la presentación, como Francisco ha dicho, en inglés. Entiendo un poco español y las preguntas después se pueden hacer en español, pero responderé en inglés porque me falta practicar el español. Y mi español está un poco oxidado. So I'm going to share my slides with you, but I need to get access to allow me to share my slides, Francisco.
Yeah. Manolo, ¿puede compartir? I think that you can share it down.
Can you see my slides? Okay, you can see them, Francisco?
Yeah, everything is fine.
Okay, so I'll start, and I said I thank you very much for inviting me to this Congress. I'm really sorry I can't be there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the value and the price of water, and I followed a little bit the introduction, especially from your alcalde de Cartagena, who was talking about valor de cada gota de agua. and I cannot agree with her more. My presentation will be about the importance of knowing the economic value of water, but also the understanding that there might be a discrepancy between the value of water and the price that we pay for the water that we use. And so I will start this Congress by giving you a very broad overview of some of the water security issues, and talk a little bit about water as an economic good. It may be very familiar for most of you that are economists, and then I'll talk a little bit about the value and the price of water, in particular the price elasticity of irrigation water, and I'll wrap up with some conclusions. So as mentioned, I'll start very broad, and I'll talk about water security in the context of water, food, and energy security. And you may have seen this picture or heard about the so-called perfect storm, a concept that was introduced by the UK chief scientist for the UK government in 2009 during a presentation that he gave in Westminster. And I saw yesterday when I had a test with Francisco that on both his sides he has the Sustainable Development Goals. The presentation that John was giving in 2009, so more than 12 years ago, was also on sustainable development in the UK. And he talked about the perfect storm that was facing humanity on this planet, related to food shortage, water scarcity, and insufficient energy resources that would cause public unrest, cross-border conflicts, and mass migration. And you can see here some of the numbers at the time by which they expected water demand, food demand, and energy demand to increase until 2030. So I'll talk very specifically about water security, which was defined by the United Nations in 2013, as you can see here on this slide, as the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, socioeconomic development, ensuring protection against pollution and water-related disasters, and preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. So very important in the context of water security is this idea that you have both a quantity and a quality aspect that may cause water shortages. And it may be less relevant for a country like Spain, but it is highly relevant for other countries around the world, including Canada, where I live nowadays. So what makes water so special? When you think about it in terms of value, on the one hand side, you could argue it's a critical environmental function, and hence it has an infinite value. It's impossible to value it because we cannot live without water. It's very complex. There are flows of water. It manifests itself as a stock, as groundwater under the earth, for example. There's quantity and quality. It's multifunctional, can be reused. And the funny thing is that it has a very high value if there's not enough, but it has a low value if there is too much of it. And that is something that is also very prominently emphasized in this whole concept of water security. And so why is this an economic issue? Why do economists deal with water as being an economic good? It's scarce, and therefore it falls under the core concept of economics. And it has value both when there is shortage of quantity and when the quality is not good enough for specific water uses. And I'm sure you've seen pictures like this where there is water shortage to grow our crops. But as I mentioned, this is where I live nowadays. This is North America. You see the map on the right top of my slide deck. And I'm living in the so-called Great Lakes district since around 5 years. And around 20% of the planet's freshwater resources are located in this place. And you see a satellite picture here of the 5 big lakes that are shared between Canada and the US. And as you can see on the picture, you see this green stuff around the edges of the lake, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, for example, but also Lake Huron. And if you can see the map, you see some light grayish areas. This is where the big population centers are: Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Toronto on the Canadian side, and here in the red dot, this is where I currently am and from which I'm talking to you. So these greenish flows that you see here are green algae, and they impair water quality, and they cause tremendous damage to the economies in both the US and the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. And just for this particular lake, Lake Erie, which is relatively shallow, and where the eutrophication is most prominent, we estimated recently that the total annual damage costs are around 270 Canadian dollars every year. And that converts to around 181 euros annually, million euros annually in economic damage costs. So there is a lot of water. 20% of the planet's fresh water resources are found here, but we cannot use it. So my water that I use here is groundwater, because this water is of the wrong quality. The costs of treating it are too high to provide it to people as drinking water. So we know that water has very important functions. Nowadays we talk about ecosystem services, aquatic ecosystem services. We use water as input in production and in consumption. We use it to irrigate our crops. We use it to process our food. Here you see an example of pickles. And we know more and more how much water we need to produce our crops and how much water is needed to then also, for example, make our clothes. So here you see an example of how much water it takes to produce a kilogram of cotton, how much water is needed then to convert that cotton into a t-shirt or into a jeans trousers. So we use a lot of water in our daily lives and in our food systems. But water is also a sink, and I know that the situation is perhaps slightly different in the area where you are, where water shortages is the main issue. But it is important to realize that we're all making use of the same water sources from which we take, and in which we then also almost free of charge discharge the waste waters that we generate. And that has big implications. For example, the eutrophication that I just mentioned to you has high economic damage costs. This is a map showing you the current global water scarcity situation in the world. It's based on the data information system from the FAO. And you can see here in Europe, Spain, in the area where you are, there is a very high level of water scarcity. And water scarcity here is defined as both the availability of water, but also having the accessibility to water, meaning that there is an infrastructure in place that allows you to use that water. And I will show you in a second a couple of more slides about how that water shortage is expected to increase in the near future. And here we see a picture over the last 110 years, freshwater use aggregated by region. The OECD countries, which is North America, Europe, Australia, Chile, they have seen and they have experienced an increase in water over the last 100 years, but not as steeply as, for example, the BRICS group of countries. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the rest of the world. So especially after the Second World War, after the 1950s, you can see that there is a very steep increase in especially the rest of the world and in the BRICS countries in water consumption, whereas it leveled off a little bit in the OECD countries after the 1980s. So we're using more and more water, and this is a picture that shows you where we are using it. This is water withdrawal by sector. Globally, agriculture is, as you will know, the biggest consumer of water, followed by industry and then domestic water use. But you can also see from this picture that there are big differences between continents. So in Europe, actually, industry is a much bigger user of fresh water than agriculture. The same applies a little bit in North America, but the situation is very differently in Oceania, which is Australia and New Zealand primarily, South America, Asia, and in Africa, where agriculture is the dominant water user. And as mentioned, we expect this water shortage to increase. This is a picture from The Economist where they calculated or they estimated the expected increase in water stress, which is the ratio of water withdrawals to renewable supply in the next 20 years or so. So currently over 2 billion people live already in countries that experience high water stress. And I showed you a picture of that before from the FAO. This global demand for water is expected to grow by 1% per year until 2050. And by that time, almost half of global output, global production is expected to come countries that face severe water scarcity or water stress. And that water stress is felt not only in rural areas where there is agriculture, also in urban areas. This is an overview of the top 10 cities in the world that face the highest risks of water shortages. And you could already see in my first slide a picture from Cape Town in South Africa that actually knew so-called day zero, the day that there was no more water left to feed the population of the city. Another city facing day zero is Sao Paulo, and you have a list here of other cities around the world, including Spain, Seville, that is in this list that faces water shortages in the near future. So there have been calculations of what these economic consequences are of water shortages. And here is an overview of what we know globally. So over the last 20 years or so, droughts and flooding affected 3 billion people and cost around $700 billion in economic damages globally. And then very particularly in the US, every drought that they had over the past 40 years or so cost around $10 billion US dollars. So these are phenomenal amounts of money that are associated with water scarcity. Over the last 20 years or so, the estimated annual cost of flooding are around 40 billion US dollars. And as I said, these costs are expected to increase as a result of climate change. So that's not a very a positive picture, so to say, of what we are going to face, what we are already facing, and what we are going to face in the near future. This is a slide where the World Bank also estimated the costs of water pollution, and they estimated that the upstream pollution would cost around 2%, up to 2% of GDP loss downstream. And here you see also a list of some of the countries where they actually quantified the annual eutrophication costs in US dollars. Again, big numbers associated with water quality. So as said, water is an economic good because it's scarce. And so that's why we as economists are interested in looking at it. And it's related to quantity and quality. The funny thing about about water resources is that we know it has value. We're not always able to quantify it precisely, but the thing is that it also often doesn't have a price, and that is related to the public good characteristics of the water resources. It's very difficult to restrict people from using it. There are often no markets in place that would somehow regulate accessibility to the resources, and in cases where it does have a price, it may not necessarily reflect the true value of water. So we do know a little bit about what these market and non-market values of water are. This is an example from the US. Typically, the value of water for lower value-added crops are somewhere at the lower end, and municipal water supply is valued most, as expected, I would say, here on the right-hand side. Somewhere in between, we have these very difficult to quantify environmental values of water. Here are the higher value-added crops, and then in between is the hydropower. And we have different tools to estimate these values, even if there is no price in place. This is an example of work that I did with Francisco and Lita several years ago in the project CIRIMET, led by CSIC in Madrid. It's called CIRIMET, which was focusing on sustainable irrigation water use, where we did experiments with farmers to assess their willingness to pay to get a guaranteed water supplies, and their preferences for ways of getting water supplied. So that included a transfer, intra-basin transfers, reclaimed wastewater, groundwater markets, or deficit irrigation. So we have these so-called non-market valuation methods to get an idea of what exactly is that value of water. This is another example from Spain, from a colleague in Valencia, Manuel Pulido and Joaquin Andreu, who are engineers, and they build hydroeconomic models, and they simulate water flows, for example, here in the Adra River Basin, and they are able, based on these simulations, to calculate shadow prices for water over time, within and between years, based on demand functions for that water. But there often is, as I said, a discrepancy between the value of water and the price of value. And here I'm showing you an example, another example from North America, from the US, where on the horizontal axis you see how much water is available, so the annual precipitation, and on the vertical axis you see how much people pay in different cities in the US for their water. And I just wanted to point to one particular city. You must have all have heard of Las Vegas, which is somewhere located here. I hope you can see my cursor. So Las Vegas is located here in Nevada. Fresno is another city located in this dark area where there is currently an extreme drought. I downloaded this here a couple of days ago for this presentation. So Las Vegas and Fresno is located in California, so it's a little bit more here to the west coast. Las Vegas is located here, so there's very little water there, and people pay, relatively speaking, compared to some other cities like Memphis and Atlanta, or Seattle. Seattle is located here. Memphis is located here in Tennessee, around here, and Atlanta is located one state further down in Georgia. So where there is more water, and people living in Atlanta, for example, or Seattle, where it rains much more, they pay a higher water bill than people, for example, in Las Vegas. So it's just an illustration of how perverse the relationship sometimes can be between water availability and the price that we pay for water. And that is something that I'm particularly interested in, because water pricing is, as you all know, the most important tool that we have to manage demand for water, together with awareness raising. But the application of market-based instruments in water policy is fairly limited, in my view, and policy is traditionally dominated by technical standards and engineering solutions. Moreover, water pricing is politically sensitive and controversial, and you can see here a snapshot of an interview that I gave more than 10 years ago in Portugal. I was declared persona non grata. I never visited the country again afterwards. After making this statement, I'm making a joke, of course, but it is really very controversial to talk about water pricing, in particular in the agricultural sector, and that is exactly what I'm going to talk about in my presentation here today, because I do believe we have to talk about this. So just some reasons why we want to price water. Francisco was already referring to the Water Framework Directive. I worked a little bit on that when I was still in Amsterdam. The Water Framework Directive asks us to have the beneficiaries of the water services, or the polluters of water, pay for the pollution that they cause. And then obviously, as an economist, we're mainly interested in how does pricing water change behavior and our demand for it. This is probably clear to you. You've heard about this before in Article 9 in the Water Framework Directive. There is mentioning of using pricing instruments to for services that are being provided, including the recovery of the costs of the water services that are provided by the public. And when the Water Framework Directive came out more than 20 years ago by now, there was a list of the usual suspects, so to say. It's water abstraction, water treatment, wastewater collection, wastewater treatment, impoundment, storage in these reservoirs, for which we currently already pay, and these were identified as the water services. If you look at how much we pay for these services, that's given in this overview of the sources of financing of these water and sanitation services. So red is what people actually pay for their use, and blue is what is funded through public budgets, typically through income taxation, for example. So there is no relationship between how much water or which water services you use and what you're paying for it. And a country like Ireland is mainly financing its water services through public budgets, whereas Denmark and the UK are trying to recover the costs of these water services much more from the customers of these water services. And so across the European Union, you see there is quite a bit of variation of the extent to which the costs of supplying the services are recovered from the users of the water. And then when the Water Framework Directive came out, there was a discussion for a while. Do we really capture all the water services that we want to see included in the Water Framework Directive in this Article 2? And there were a number of people that were arguing that there are other ecosystem services that should be accounted for perhaps as well, including crop irrigation, that perhaps should be subject to pricing. And that never, as far as I know, took really place. So the European Commission was actually taken to court, I think in around 2009 or so, by a number of NGOs about the fact that they used this very narrow interpretation of what water services are. Because the moment you identify something as a service, you have to pay for it. You have to show that there is cost recovery for that water service, and that is only the case if you have officially identified the service. Only then you are asked to look at cost recovery through different pricing mechanisms. For these other much more difficult to value and price ecosystem services, this is not the case. We're interested in changing demand, and I'm interested in my work looking at the effectiveness of economic policy instruments, and so we look at the price elasticity typically of water demand to see how water demand or water use would change as a result of introducing or increasing the price. And in my experience, there is quite a lot of confusion among policymakers, non-economic policymakers, what that price elasticity of water demand actually is. And that's why I'm showing you this graph here. Water is typically considered as an inelastic good, which is interpreted as it doesn't matter what price you charge for water, the demand or the use will not change. In economics, we would call that perfectly inelastic, meaning there is a price elasticity of 0. You change the price, there is no reduction in the demand or the use of the water. If the change in the use or demand is less than proportionate to the increase in the price, it's called inelastic. And if it is more than proportionate to the increase in the price, it's called elastic. So to give you an example, you increase the price by 10% and demand reduces by 5%. So that gives us the indication that it is inelastic. It doesn't mean that it is perfectly inelastic. the price elasticity is negative. By the way, it is negative because we increase the price and then demand is supposed to go down. So that's why we have a negative value here on the vertical axis here. Yeah, so, and it's elastic. If you increase the price by 10%, then the use would be reduced by, say, 15% or 20%. Yeah, so it's more than proportionate to the increase in the price. And you see a number of important users listed here at the bottom of the graph. Residential indoor is typically inelastic, around 0.2, 0.3. So households, residential households, will reduce their water use by say 3% if you would increase the price by 10%. Industry is a little bit more elastic, but nevertheless inelastic. So because of limitations of the extent to which you can replace water by water-saving technologies, for example, there is some elasticity, but it is limited. And then there are residential outdoor uses. So that means watering your lawn, for example. So if you live in a dry climate, that will be much more inelastic than when you live in a wet climate. And it's simply related to the fact that you have substitution possibilities. If it rains a lot and you start increasing the price, people won't water their lawn. They will use the natural rainfall, or they will collect the rainfall to water their lawn. Whereas if you live in a dry climate, these substitution possibilities are much more limited, and hence that restricts the elasticity of your demand. So obviously the biggest missing component here or sector is agriculture. And so if you look into the literature, one of the first papers looking at the price elasticity of irrigation water use is by Susan Schuyling, John Loomis, and the late Bob Young, published in Water Resources Research. And the interesting thing that they showed is that there is a highly significant positive relationship between the price farmers already pay for their irrigation water and the absolute value of the price elasticity. Yeah, so the positive relationship indicates that if the price is higher, the absolute value of the price elasticity is also higher. Yeah, so the more you pay, the more sensitive you become to the increase in the price, and the more likely you are to reduce your water use. So this was one of the first studies that was carried out in 2006. It was only for the US, and it was based on a limited number of observations that you see here at the bottom of the graph. So in this project called CIRIMET, in which I collaborated with Francisco and Lita, we also did a follow-up meta-analysis. So we collected more studies, we had more observations, and not only restricted to the US, we also included a number of other countries in our database. And what we found was the same result. We found a significant positive correlation between the price that farmers pay for their irrigation water and the elasticity. So the higher the price, the more elastic their demand is, meaning that they're more sensitive to increases in the price. And very recently, I've started updating that database with more studies. So we went from, 39 studies worldwide to 62 studies now worldwide. We've got 510 observations, so many more observations, including additional Spanish studies that generated actually quite a lot of observations, 78 from people that you probably have heard of, or that are maybe even in the room with you today, from the University of Cordoba, like Julio Berbel, Alberto Garrido from UMP, the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, Eva Iglesias, Maria Blanco. So these studies were included in that update of the database, and no matter what model we specified, we find the same consistent positive relationship between price and the absolute value of the price elasticity, whilst controlling for a wide variety of additional covariates. And I'm showing you some of the results that we managed to produce. So we have a global model here, and we specified, for example, as Schuyling did in 2006 in Water Resources Research. We also estimated a new model, and we extended that new model with additional variables that you see here, for example. And we control for all kinds of study environmental characteristics. So for example, I highlighted that here in red. The annual precipitation has a highly significant, or has a significant, statistically significant positive effect on the price elasticity as expected. If it rains more, people are more sensitive to increases in the price. They will simply stop using the water for which they have to pay and rely more on rain-fed agriculture. Yeah, so we control for farm characteristics, cultivated crops. This is a continuation of the same table. It's a very big table with a lot of covariates, as you can see. And this is in red, the variable that I'm particularly interested in again. So this is the log of the average price measured in dollars per cubic meters. And no matter how we specify the model, we find this significant positive correlation between the price that farmers already pay and the absolute value of the price elasticity. So the higher the price, the higher the elasticity. So the more sensitive farmers are to an increase in the price. And you probably don't have to understand or have to be an economist to understand that. If you already pay a lot of money for something, if you start increasing the price by 1 or 10%, you are more likely to reduce the consumption of that good than if you pay hardly anything for it and you hardly notice that the price has been increased. That is what is being picked up by this particular variable. Yeah, so we control, in this case, for different countries, water shortage adaptation strategies, where we find some interesting results of what farmers indicate they would do if they have a water shortage. But this average price is what we're particularly interested in. So what I also did in preparation of this talk is to go back to the database, and I actually made a comparison between your Spanish studies and the rest of the world, ROW. And I looked at the mean price elasticity in the rest of the world and in Spain, and I compared that with the mean price in US dollars in 2019 price levels per cubic meter. So what you see here on the right-hand side is the mean price paid for irrigation water in the rest of the world, which is 0.18 cents per cubic meter, 0.23 in Spain. So that is around 0.20 and 0.16 euro cents per cubic meters in 2019 price levels. And so in Spain, you pay more for your water already than you do in the rest of the world. Your price elasticity, the mean price elasticity that I managed to retrieve from these 78 observations from these Spanish authors that I just showed you, is also much higher than the mean price elasticity in the rest of the world. It's actually elastic, not inelastic. If you look at the medians, then we enter the inelastic domain again. So there is a wide spread in these values, but it is quite remarkable that the mean price elasticity in Spain is so much higher than in the rest of the world, and you also pay around 25% more for your water already than you do in the rest of the world, which might explain your higher price elasticity. Yeah, so I actually tested quickly the differences that I show you here between Spain and the rest of the world for the average price. That is statistically significantly different, and the same applies for the mean price elasticity. Yeah, so you pay more for your water, and as a result, perhaps you also display a higher irrigation water price elasticity. I'm almost at the end of my talk. I just wanted to show you that what I find for agriculture is not different from what we find for residential water demand. So this is a study published in 2003 in land economics by a colleague of mine at the VU, at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in 2003. And they find exactly the same thing. At the 5% level, they find a significant correlation between the average price that residential households pay for their water use and the absolute value of the price elasticity. So also for residential water demand, it's the same positive relationship. The more people pay, the more sensitive they will become to water pricing. They won't respond very much to increases in water prices if they hardly pay anything for their water. Yeah, and I wanted to end off with a couple of words about the importance of putting this in the right context when you talk about water pricing. So the main message that I wanted to share with you is that the price elasticity of irrigation water is negative. And even if it's not elastic, but inelastic, it means that farmers will reduce their water use if you start introducing or increasing the price of irrigation water. And that goes against, in my experience, the fairly wide-held perception among non-economics policymakers that water demand is inelastic, what economists would call perfectly inelastic, meaning there is no response. So forget about water pricing. So that's not the case. It does respond, and the extent to which it responds depends, among others, on the price that people already pay. And it doesn't matter if you're a residential household or whether you're a farmer. An important point here, in addition, is to assess how much are we actually spending on water, and especially under the current pandemic. One of the things that we've learned is that water services are essential. We cannot control the pandemic without having access to clean and safe drinking water. We need to wash our hands every day, every minute we go out of the door. And so there are essential services provided by many municipalities, local, regional governments in providing us with these services. And the question is, are we paying the full cost of providing those services, and what is the impact of what we pay for these services on our income? And that is what is displayed in this slide. On the horizontal axis, you see what we as European citizens pay per capita for water services, water and sanitation, so that's drinking water supply and wastewater treatment, and what share of those expenditures are in GDP. Yeah, so most of the European member states do not spend more than 0.8% of their GDP on these essential water services. And so, as you saw in that previous slide with the blue and the red colors, it has a lot to do with how you finance and fund your water services as well. A lot of those services are not charged at full cost recovery because there is a lot of cross-subsidization taking place. And so it's a very political question then to think about what is a reasonable share of GDP that we want or that we expect our citizens to pay for these essential water services. So I'm going to repeat a little bit what I already said to you before. Price elasticity of water is negative. Users do react to price increases, and increasing water prices or introducing water pricing is expected to have an effect, but the effect depends on how high the price is that people are being asked to pay, farmers or residential households. And the fact that you don't maybe immediately in some cases see a direct reduction in water use may very well be related to the fact that they simply don't notice it. I give classes on water resource economics. I ask my students, and I know this is a particular segment of society, but I'm asking, what is the price that you pay for your water? No one knows. If we do public surveys and you ask people, what are you paying for your water? Maybe it's different in Spain, but in Northwest Europe, a lot of people have no idea. Here in Canada, people have no clue what they're paying for their water. And that is, among others, related to the fact that it's negligible. They hardly pay anything. It's really very little that they are paying for their water. And that might be an important reason why there is a limited response, be it irrigation water use or be it domestic water use. So I'm a proponent of exploring the increased use of water pricing. But we should never forget that water pricing should always be part of a policy mix, so to say. And that policy mix means that we have demand-side management tools like water pricing, but we also have important supply-side management tools. So we do have technologies that we can implement in agriculture, for example, to reduce water use in a lot of countries. I'm not saying that that's the case in Spain, because you are already in such a drought prone situation, and investigating alternative water sources at the same time. So that should all be part of the policy mix. And it's very important, of course, to talk about efficiency and equity at the same time. What is the price that can be charged that is still affordable to people, to farmers, to residential households or industry? And it's important to raise consumer awareness, in my view, and address the often imperfect price transmission of increasing the water price. There's also a lot of misunderstanding, in my experience, about whether or not farmers pay for water. You go to a country like India, you ask them, are you paying for your water? And they all say yes. They don't pay for water, but they pay for the electricity to pump up the water. And that's something completely different. So what I'm arguing for here is the resource itself is scarce, and the resource itself has to be protected. And we have to think about efficient but also equitable ways of making that value of scarce water more visible to the consumer, but also to the producer. And finally, my last bullet point is we obviously need a level playing field. If Spain is the only country that's going to introduce, then other countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, is not going to introduce. We create an unfair competitive advantage for other countries, or for other, even within one and the same river basin, or between different regions in one and the same country. And we obviously want to avoid that. So this needs to be a concerted effort, in my view, where cooperation and collaboration is key to make that work. So that was my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take any now. Here are some websites for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about my research group here in Waterloo. And this is the journal that Francisco was also referring to, Water Resources and Economics, in which we publish a lot of the work that I'm also talking about here today. Alberto Garrido is actually on the editorial board of the journal. So thank you so much once again for the very, very kind invitation. Thank you very much for having me with you. It's un gran honor de estar con vosotros. Lo siento otra vez que no puedo estar acá en persona.
Bien. Muchas gracias, Roy. Thank you very much. Creo que hablo en español, creo que vamos un poco sobre el tiempo, entonces no hay mucho tiempo, pero para un par de preguntas, si alguien del público tiene alguna pregunta, podríamos tener. ¿Una pregunta? Si no, te la hago yo. ¿En español o en inglés, Roy? La pregunta te la hago en español.
¿Cómo quieres? Do it in English.
Okay, in English. Okay, so from your presentation, we can see that that water gives a nice signal for water exchange between region or between area, because it's a quite reaction for the price. Here where we live in Murcia, the water price is really high. So if we look at the signal, we can guess that here farmer can pay for the water from other region, and we can make, for example, transference or right exchange or something like that. However, here there is no social agreement associated with this exchange. I'm wondering, what do you think about that? So, because probably the chain of water right, or the chain of water resources by using transference is a good way following this signal to achieve the sustainability of the irrigation water. What do you think about that?
So I'm a little bit aware of the water transfer discussions in Spain. So especially in the context of sustainability, I think it's important, as in any broader economic welfare analysis, that you look at the full costs and benefits of water transfers. So you might be able to achieve a higher price for the water in the region where you are, but by drawing away water from other areas, just focusing on the financial price of the water that you're willing to pay, or that farmers are able to pay, maybe even in the area of Cartagena, would perhaps not do any justice to the potential negative externalities that you might create, both environmentally and socially, by taking water away from one basin and transferring it to the other. So I think in those cases, it's very important that you get a very clear, full account of all the costs and benefits associated with the withdrawal and transfer of that water from one basin to the other. You might seriously impair an agri-food industry in the area where you take the water from, even though they don't pay as much for the water as you would be able to obtain in Cartagena. And those kind of effects are maybe not very desirable if you talk about sustainability.
Okay, thank you very much. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Alguien por aquí? ¿No? Pues yo creo que vamos a... Pues Roy, muchas gracias por todo, gracias en nombre de toda la organización del Congreso. Ha sido un placer compartir contigo esta tarde y bueno, esperemos que la próxima vez pues, nos podamos ver en persona. Muchísimas gracias por todo.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, pues gracias. Pasamos a la siguiente sesión. ¿Sí? ¿Quieres que se un poco de...